Saigon, April 1975. Not the maps, not the speeches, not the official assurances. The real history is down at the waterline, where families stood in the dark with whatever remained of their lives compressed into one bag, one child, one last negotiation. A physician could be wealthy in every way that the collapsing system still recognized. A townhouse, a bank balance, diplomas, introductions, property deeds folded carefully in an envelope. In ordinary times, these things marked status, stability, and a future. But at the dock, they became evidence of a category error. Because a border collapse does not ask what you own. It asks what can move. In those final days, there were people with accounts they could prove, homes they could document, and careers that had taken decades to build. None of it mattered to the boatman, the fixer, the military officer at the checkpoint, or the smuggler deciding who boarded and who did not. The family next to them did not produce bank records. They did not offer land titles. They handed over a tiny flattened square of metal, and space appeared where there had been none. That is the scene most people misunderstand when they talk about safe assets. They imagine inflation hedges, portfolio protection, long-term stores of value. But history is harsher than that. In a true rupture, physical wealth is not mainly for buying groceries. It is for crossing thresholds, a dock, a checkpoint, a border gate, a place on a truck, a seat on a boat, a weekend transit, a first room in a foreign city. This video is about that distinction. Not gold as ideology, not gold as nostalgia. Gold is a border technology. And more importantly, why even there? Most people still choose the wrong form and discover the mistake when there is no time left to correct it. The first mistake people make in studying collapse is assuming that wealth has one job. It does not. In normal life, wealth can sit still. It can remain in accounts, in registries, in property files, in pension statements, in brokerage dashboards, in the quiet confidence that a claim recorded somewhere is the same thing as control. That illusion survives right up until movement becomes mandatory. Then the function changes. At that moment, wealth is no longer a balance sheet concept. It becomes a transit instrument. It must survive search, panic, extortion, delay, confiscation, power loss, language barriers, and the contempt of strangers who know you need them more than they need you. That is why the history of forced exits looks so brutal to anyone raised inside stable institutions. The people who escaped were not always the richest. Very often, they were the people whose wealth had been translated into a form that could operate under pressure. In the late 1970s, Vietnamese refugees paid for passage in taels of gold, and major boat escapes were priced in that language, with chilling precision. Adults charged in gold, children at reduced rates. Ethnic Vietnamese, sometimes facing higher extraction than others. A fortune was being remeasured, not by accountants, but by smugglers, officials, and transport networks. And this is where the thesis of the entire video begins to narrow. Physical wealth is not primarily for daily consumption during a breakdown. It is for crossing the expensive gates inside the breakdown. A border guard does not need your long-term inflation hedge. A boat organizer does not care about the future resale value of your property. A checkpoint officer does not want your argument about intrinsic worth. They want immediate settlement in a form they recognize, trust, and can reuse without explanation. That is a very different standard from ordinary investing. The useful asset in a border crisis must be small enough to conceal, common enough to verify, divisible enough to match unequal demands, and final enough that no bank, grid, or third party needs to complete the transaction. This is why paper claims fail first. But it is also why large format precious metal often fails right behind them, because once wealth leaves the legal system, denomination becomes destiny. A house deed may be too institutional to matter. A bank balance may be too distant to reach. But a single oversized bar can also be too large to use. In a rupture, the question is not merely whether your asset is real, it is whether it can make exact change for survival. This is where the story gets forensic. When people say, the refugees brought gold, the phrase is true, but far too vague to be useful. The important question is, what kind of gold was accepted inside the escape economy, and why? In Vietnam and across parts of Southeast Asia, gold was not just wealth. It was already a parallel language of settlement. The relevant unit was the tael, roughly 37.5 grams, and brands such as Kim Ton had recognition that mattered under stress, because they were familiar in regional trade and widely understood as high-purity bullion. That meant the asset carried not only metal value, but verification value. In a panic market, that second property is often just as important as the first. And notice the shape of the system. People were not fleeing into a formal auction market with receipts and assay desks. They were dealing with smugglers, transport brokers, corrupt officials, checkpoint guards, black market intermediaries, and other refugees. Under those conditions, the ideal asset is not the theoretically most valuable one. It is the one that can be recognized in seconds, hidden on the body, and transferred without argument. Reports from the refugee exodus describe exit payments and passage fees commonly priced in taels of gold, with adult departures sometimes costing the equivalent of around $3,000 and children often charged less. The regime, local officials, and escape networks all understood that gold was the settlement layer beneath the official system. Now here is the part that modern gold commentary often misses. A 1-ounce bar sounds practical in a peaceful country. It is standardized. It is internationally recognized. It is convenient for a collector, a vault client, or an investor building a position over time. But the border economy is not built for investor convenience. It is built for ugly, uneven, improvised transactions. A desperate family may need one payment for a fishing boat captain, another for a policeman who suddenly sees too much, another for forged travel papers, another for a truck compartment, another for medicine, another for silence, another for the first rented room after landfall. Those are not equal payments. They arrive in sequence, not all at once. They are negotiated under pressure. And every transaction exposes the holder to a new danger if you reveal too much value too early. You advertise that you still have more. That changes how people treat you. It changes the size of the next demand. It can make you a target before you even reach the water. That is why the format of the metal mattered as much as the metal itself. Kim Thon pieces became associated with refugee flight precisely because they functioned as portable, recognized, body-concealable wealth inside a region where tael-based gold circulation was already normal. The point was not romance. The point was operational fit. These bars were part of an ecosystem that knew how to price movement in gold. But even here, there is a trap. A full tael is portable. It is not necessarily granular enough, and this is where the mythology breaks. Because once you understand the mechanics, you realize that owning gold is still too imprecise. The real question is whether your gold can be broken into the exact sizes demanded by fear, bribery, transport, and restart. Some surviving Kim Tham pieces were thin, sectional, and associated with a culture of practical exchange rather than ceremonial storage. The refugees were not choosing objects for display. They were choosing denominations for survival. So the lesson from the boat crisis is not simply that paper failed and gold worked. The lesson is narrower, harder, and more useful. The winning asset was the one that matched the transaction geometry of escape. And once we bring that logic into the present, an uncomfortable comparison appears. Today, millions of people believe they own perfectly portable wealth because it lives on a tiny device, behind a password, inside a mathematically elegant system. But borders do not run on elegance. They run on power, time, access, recognition, and settlement under duress. Consider the modern refugee carrying a Bitcoin hardware wallet. On paper, it looks like the perfect escape asset. It weighs almost nothing. It can hold substantial value. It crosses a border without setting off a metal detector. It does not require a bank's permission to someone thinking in peacetime abstractions. It appears superior to physical bullion in almost every way. Then the real conditions begin. You leave under shelling. The power grid fails intermittently. Mobile towers are overloaded or damaged. Border crossings are backed up for hours, then days. Your phone battery becomes a rationed resource. You arrive in a transit zone where you need a bus seat, a room, antibiotics, a SIM card, translated documents, and someone willing to help before official systems catch up. None of those people are interested in your cryptographic elegance. They want settlement now. This is the part digital asset debates usually avoid. They assume the owner still has the chain of requirements necessary to make digital wealth usable. Electricity device integrity, memorized credentials, internet access, a functioning exchange route, a counterparty willing to accept the transfer, and enough time and privacy to execute it without error. Remove even 2 or 3 of those conditions, and the asset may remain valuable in theory while becoming unusable in sequence. That does not mean digital assets are worthless. It means they belong to a different stage of the crisis. Digital wealth can be highly effective for storing value across jurisdictions, rebuilding after arrival, or moving capital once you have regained connectivity, documentation, and operational stability. But that is not the same thing as handling the dirty middle of escape, the checkpoint, the smuggler, the landlord in cash economy conditions, the border town fixer, the driver leaving in 10 minutes, the clinic that wants payment before treatment. Those are friction points of immediate settlement. A hardware wallet may preserve wealth across time. It does not automatically purchase action across a dark border. And that brings us to the central mathematical problem that destroys so many supposedly safe assets in the real world. Not whether they are valuable, not whether they are scarce, not whether they outperform inflation over decades, whether they can be divided to the size of the danger in front of you, because in a collapse, almost nothing is priced at the exact size of what you hold. Here is the divisibility trap in its simplest form. You need a favor that costs the equivalent of $300. A guard looks the other way. A driver takes your family to a secondary crossing. A clerk pushes your papers to the top of the pile. The amount is ugly but imaginable. The problem is that the only portable wealth you brought is a 1-ounce gold bar worth roughly $4,000. In a stable market, this sounds like a trivial inconvenience. In a collapse, it can be fatal. Because there is no trusted cashier at the border. No one is making change. No one is handing back the unused portion of your desperation. The moment you reveal a unit far larger than the transaction, you trigger 3 consequences at once. First, you overpay massively. That is the optimistic scenario. Second, you reveal that you possess more value than the immediate request requires. That turns a small extraction into a sequence of extractions. The first bribe becomes proof that further bribes are available. The person in front of you is no longer negotiating one payment. He is evaluating inventory. Third, you force the counterparty to solve a verification and resale problem. If the item is too large, unfamiliar, or difficult to subdivide, he may reject it altogether. Not because it lacks value, but because it lacks usability for him. In crisis economies, people prefer the asset they can move tomorrow over the asset that is theoretically worth more next month. This is why denomination is not a detail. It is the architecture of survival. The correct unit for border transit is not as much as possible in the smallest space. It is the smallest trusted unit that still clears likely transactions. You need pieces large enough to matter, small enough to conceal, common enough to verify, and numerous enough that one exposure does not reveal the whole reserve. That leads to a very different design logic than conventional bullion ownership. You do not carry one monolith. You carry layers. One layer for immediate movement, another for mid-route contingencies, another for restart after arrival. And these layers are not stored together because concentrated value is fragile value. A single search, theft, seizure, or panic mistake can erase it. The historical record keeps returning to the same principle. Distribution beats concentration under coercive conditions. That means fractional distribution across denominations, across locations on the body, across carriers when traveling with trusted adults, and across stages of the journey. It also means understanding the legal destination problem, because the very asset that saves you during transit can become a liability if you arrive in a jurisdiction with declaration rules, customs thresholds, or unexplained source questions you did not prepare for. So the real protocol is not simply buy small gold. It is to build a transport logic that matches three separate realities: escape, transit, and lawful re-entry into a system on the other side. The forensic record leaves a narrow conclusion. When systems fail, wealth separates into two categories. The first category looks impressive inside normal institutions: accounts, titles, digital balances, large bars, property claims, retirement statements, perfectly optimized abstractions. The second category survives contact with borders: assets that can be recognized quickly, divided cleanly, hidden discreetly, surrendered selectively, and declared lawfully when the journey is over. That is the basis of a fractional exit strategy, not a fantasy of carrying your entire net worth on your body, not an ideological rejection of modern finance. A workflow. One layer sized for immediate movement, one layer sized for regular payments during transit, one protected reserve for restart after arrival. Nothing concentrated in a single piece. Nothing dependent on a single battery, a single password, a single official, or a single point of failure. And even this needs caveats. No asset solves every crisis. Gold can be stolen. Borders change. Laws differ by destination. Search intensity varies. Local recognition varies. A family with children, medical needs, or elderly parents faces constraints. A single traveler does not. The point is not certainty. The point is reducing fatal mismatches between the shape of your wealth and the shape of the emergency. That is what the doc in 1975 teaches. The decisive line was never rich versus poor. It was portable versus trapped. So the choice is binary. You can keep mistaking recorded wealth for mobile control and hope the infrastructure around you never hardens into a gate. Or you can study how people actually escaped when history stopped being theoretical, and hold at least part of your survival capital in a form that can cross with you.